Well, good morning or afternoon, everybody. We're about 10 minutes away from the top of the hour and the start of today's CSPEN webinar, part of our summer webinar series. We welcome all of you who have already started to join us. We'll get started here in 10 minutes. Welcome. We'll talk again soon. Well, good morning or afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's CSPEN summer webinar series. Today, we'll be focusing on the recent completion of the Department of Education's virtual hearings on proposed revisions to the regulations based on the new administration coming in and a number of issues related to the statute as presented to them from the Carissa Act at the end of December of last year. We'll get started here in another 5 minutes. Welcome to all of you that are attending and coming in early. We have several hundred participants today, so thank you for sharing time on a Friday with CSPEN. We hope that you enjoyed the recaps that we did throughout the course of the week and the ability to share more information with you today. We'll get started here in another 5 minutes. Well, good morning or afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's CSPEN webinar, part of our summer webinar series. We welcome the over 200 plus or close to 300 individuals that will be joining us on today's webinar. We will get started here in just a couple of minutes, but a couple of the refreshers and reminders of the do's and don'ts. Since it has been over 2 weeks since last we spoke, this is the opportunity for us to share with you the latest information on the Department of Education's virtual hearings that took place over the course of this week. In addition, we'll give you a brief legislative update, but the major focus this time around will be regulatory in nature. You do have the opportunity to ask questions, and I do hope that there will be some discussion around several of the key points that we'll be going over today. We will get started here in about another 2 to 3 minutes. Welcome those of you, and if you're looking for your question and answers, it's either on the top of your dashboard or on the right-hand side of your computer screen, depending on how GoToWebinar comes into your system. So please have that available for questions and dialogue throughout the course of the presentation. And we'll get started here in just another 2 minutes. Well, it's straight up 2 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., or Silver Spring, Maryland, where I'm coming to you from my home. We welcome all of you today for today's Friday, as opposed to Thursday, summer webinar series presented by CSPEN. Today is a major focus on the events of this week that took place by the U.S. Department of Education, and in particular, their discussions and virtual hearings around potential changes and proposed changes to the regulations based on the Biden administration and also on legislation enacted at the tail end of the 116th Congress that is being worked upon as well. We want to welcome the several hundred plus of you individuals that are joining with us today on a Friday. We appreciate your participation and hope to be able to share and provide you with not only timely, current, and sourceable information, but enter into you, especially today, on a dialogue around some of the major issues that are part of these pending negotiated rulemaking and our positions and some of our adversaries' positions as it relates to those various issues. We hope that this will be the precursor for your ability, as well as ours, meaning CSPEN's, to submit final comments to the Department of Education by the deadline of July 1st of this year. But I am getting a little bit ahead of myself. A couple of normal reminders and do's and don'ts. This is being audio taped and videotaped for later playback at your leisure on CSPEN's website. We will also be trying to respond to any questions I don't answer or can't answer here, whether that be potentially on some questions you may have around continuation of some of the HERF guidance, not the focus of today's webinar, but in case you have some of those questions, and those are, I still have some schools that have some of those lingering questions, but also for your feedback and commentary, as I said, on the negotiated rulemaking issues that we'll be spending today discussing. So without further ado, my name is Tom Netting, not Jerry. Just many of you know that there's a difference between the Tom and Jerry show. Myself, along with co-executive director Jerry Prochaska. Today's webinar on a Friday will focus on a legislative and regulatory update. Again, the primary focus is on the Department of Education's virtual hearings that took place this week. We will start off with a brief legislative update, which I'll share with you now. As you may recall from the last we met, which was 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks and a day ago, we had just completed a week of success in terms of stalling, but not necessarily eliminating forever, the consideration of a provision that would be negative for both many of the students attending portions of our community in various disciplines, as well as a number of institutions within our community that offer short-term programs. What we're referring to is a provision that's in the Anti-China Act, or more commonly referred to as the Endless Frontiers, and now the United States Innovation and Collaboration Act, which is basically now moving over to the House that we'll talk about in just a minute. But the provision itself that we were fortunate to work with members of Congress on the Senate side to delete or omit was specifically focused on elimination of the existing short-term loan program eligibility, that being the 300 to 600 hour eligibility for institutions within the community that provide short-term programs, and the establishment of a new job training Pell Grant program that would basically supplant the loan program. Major issues were that instead of it being between 300 and 600 hours, the new grant program would be between 150 and 600 hour programs. Good news. The bad news being that only certain sectors of the higher education community would be eligible to participate, which excludes the for-profit industry and all of our students and institutions from the potential future utilization of this new grant assistance program if it were to be enacted. It also outlined the roles and responsibilities of what the now Secretary of Education, Mr. Cardona, would be responsible for doing in establishing the program, and would also provide for key parameters with regard to assessment in order to be eligible to participate. Again, what was interesting is that from the prior legislation that was originally introduced in the House and Senate, called the Jobs Act, there were provisions modified in this much broader proposal that they were seeking to add to the Senate legislation. Well, long story short, after a great deal of work by our entire community, calls to action from CSPEN, calls to action from other state associations, as well as national trade associations, some of them literally just the day before or the day of the vote on these particular issues, there were the opportunity to try and suggest that this provision not be included. It was part of a package of some 42 to 43 amendments that were all combined in block into what was being called a manager's package. And it was thought that this would be moving through in a bipartisan fashion because some 30 plus of those provisions were bipartisan in nature, including this one, represented by both and introduced by both Mr. Kane from Virginia, as well as Mr. Portman from Ohio, a Democrat, and Mr. Kane, a Republican, and Mr. Portman, that were moving this forward. But there were also 19 Democratic specific amendments. And so as a result of the fact that, again, there were individuals on the Republican side of the aisle that didn't like the overall complexion of this package, and also potentially not only some of the policy issues driven in it, but also the cost of them, Rand Paul stood up and objected to the unanimous consent request to have them added. And that sent this proposal, as well as the rest of those 40 some odd proposals, down to defeat. Doesn't mean, once again, that they're not coming up. Before we move to where they are coming up over in the House, I also wanted to highlight the other issue that we continue to track on behalf of our community and quite candidly on behalf of all of higher ed, which is the fact that James Quall, our President Biden's recommendation to or nominee to be the Undersecretary of Education, the highest ranking position within the Department of Education when it comes to higher education policy, moved pretty swiftly with one hearing through the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee back in April, and in May, late May, early April, they had his hearing, and then on April 21st, he was reported out of the Health Committee to the full Senate floor for consideration and a vote on final approval, so that he could then take his position over in the Department of Education. Well, that was 2 months ago. And we're still waiting for Mr. Quall to receive his confirmation. The reason we're understanding for the delay that has been quite extensive at this point is because, in particular, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts has a hold on Mr. Quall's confirmation at the full Senate level. What we're hearing and what was written up in Politico and elsewhere is that Senator Warren, along with other members of the Progressive Party, who are very much in favor of student loan debt cancellation and other reforms to the student loan programs, have placed a hold on Mr. Quall's opportunity to be the undersecretary in order to try and put pressure and negotiate with the White House, because James is the recommendation of the Biden administration, to try and put pressure on those negotiations around key issues that Senate Democrats like Ms. Warren and Mr. Sanders want. So as we sit here today, we still have no Undersecretary of Education, even though he's been pending since 2 months ago, literally 2 months and a week almost ago, from when his initial opportunity to be brought forward to the Senate floor was. Moving over to the House very quickly, again, while we were collectively capable of defeating more by policy than by big P politics than by little p policy, the inclusion of the Kane-Portman provision with regard to short-term programs, we must keep up the efforts and be vigilant to try and prevent that legislation from being reintroduced when the House takes up the legislation. Normally, if you recall, your Civics 101 legislation moves from the House to the Senate and then is brought through in conference before enactment of a final proposal. This time, it's going the opposite direction. The majority leader, Mr. Schumer, brought forward the legislation in the Senate first, and it's now up to Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House and the Democrats in the House to take control of the legislation that has come before them, determine whether or not they want to make modifications or pass the bill as is. Keep in mind that this was a provision in a bill that is very, very voluminous. You'll recall from prior C-SPEN reporting that there were over 600 amendments offered to this bill, what's affectionately called in Washington, D.C., a Christmas tree bill. Again, the analogy being that you're putting ornaments on a Christmas tree the same way they were attempting to add all manner of provisions to this major piece of legislation that, because of its influence with regard to China and the anti-China movement, were things that is something that likely is hopefully at the end of the day a must pass, but what's included on it is therefore a matter of great importance. Well, Speaker Pelosi has yet to determine exactly when she hopes to determine or just move forward with S-1260, but what we here at CSPEN are encouraging heavily for you as institutions to consider doing is to already start now with the ability to reach out to your members of Congress in the House and share with them opposition to any potential inclusion of the provisions similar to what was offered up in the Senate. Now, as part of that, we are also saying that that is not bad policy. It's bad policy only because it is exclusionary to many of the students and many of the institutions most adept and candidly with the best outcomes in order to bring those individuals into the workforce and to do it expeditiously. So you'll see here part 1 of 2 of the messages that we're encouraging you to bring forward. When you look at these, we will share them with you and also share template letters that we put together with redline copies of how to correct both the Jobs Act, which is the precursor legislation, as well as the introduced in the Senate provision, which was expanded to include the loan eligibility and other issues. Long-winded way of saying that we're walking and chewing gum at the same time. We're continuing to fight these proposals as they move through Congress, but the major focus of today was a very busy week on the regulatory side. It meant that CSPEN didn't have the opportunity to move forward in review of the hearing that was held on the House Education and Labor Committee with Secretary Cardona, but we will be reviewing that and giving you a summary of that next week. Sorry for the delay, but we couldn't be 2 places at once. And we thought that the priority should be what we're going to spend the best next part of the hour or so discussing as a community. And that's the regulatory update around federal student financial aid and the publication of both originally a soft notice and then an official Federal Register notice back in May that alluded to the fact that the Department of Education was going to look to make considerable potential revisions to the federal student financial aid Title IV regulations. And in order to start that process, they were going to hold 3 virtual hearings on June 21st, 23rd, and 24th. Well, those hearings concluded yesterday, and CSPEN provided summaries at the end of each day on what happened on Monday, on Wednesday, and again on yesterday with regard to 14 specific issues and a couple of additional requests the Department of Education had put forward as proposed topics for this next rounds of federal negotiated rulemaking. You'll see the 14 listed here along with their Code of Federal Regulations citations. We will be sharing this PowerPoint with you because embedded in this PowerPoint are the links to each of those regulatory sections under this portion of the slide presentation. You'll also note that the actual Federal Register notice from back on May 26th is included at the bottom of this page and 1 or 2 more of the subsequent pages. That way you can go back and look at both the actual final Federal Register, which we're summarizing here, and also have additional access to these individual links if that's an easier way for you to get access to the information. But you'll note that the 14 areas that are highlighted here are a number that are important to our students and our schools, and candidly, a number that are, as we expected they would be, targeted towards our institutions and schools in light of President Biden and Ms. Harris's pledges during the campaign trail to do certain reforms, not only within the proprietary sector, but broader reforms in both the student loan programs and institutional accountability. As you look down this list, and we will look at it in much greater detail here in just a few minutes, you'll see that there's a great deal of differentiation in terms of what the 14 issues are. And they do kind of break into 2 pretty distinct categories. One around student loan related issues, including things like the opportunity for discharge of borrowers with total and permanent disability, issues around the public service loan forgiveness program, discussions around discharges of false certifications, as well as the discharge of individuals with closed schools as part of the loan side, as well as the opportunity to discuss the concerns around the loan program, the loan repayment programs themselves In particular, a great deal of the discussion in the virtual hearings that we'll talk about momentarily were around income-driven repayment, but those kind of break down one whole section of the process. The other portion of the process focuses on a number of institutional accountability issues: change of ownership, ability to benefit, gainful employment, borrower defense to repayment. Pell Grant eligibility falls kind of under student access, and you'll see the way I kind of parse these out here in just a minute. Well, based on these 14 issues and the following comments from the department, that they would also like information on the gaps in post-secondary outcomes on retention, completion, loan repayment, and student defaults by race, ethnicity, gender, and other key student characteristics, it showed that the department is also looking to see whether or not there is broad support, or what kind of support and what limitations the higher ed community might have around more data. And we look at that particular provision as an opportunity to have and engage in those discussions, especially given the fact that when you look at the characteristics that they are hoping to disaggregate a lot of this information, it speaks to the types of issues and the type of student populations that most, I would dare say, but certainly many of our community and our institutions bring forward in terms of their quality education and entrance into the workforce, or their continuation in their chosen career path. You'll note that the department also put a final date of this coming Thursday, a week from their final hearing of yesterday, for any public comments to be provided, while they provided and actually expanded the amount of time for public comment this week from what was supposed to be essentially 12 hours to 14 hours, adding 30 minutes to Wednesdays and Thursdays presentations to enable more commenters to present. And ultimately, around 156 to 160 presenters did present. They recognize that that is not going to be the full robust number of individuals that want to submit comments. So they are continuing to provide for written comments to be provided between now and next Thursday. Keep that in mind, because that will become critical to the reason for these discussions as CSPEN works to submit their proposal by that effective date, and also share with you the early part of next week the efforts of our efforts and our labor to see whether or not you might want to use those in any future submissions that you as individual institutions make. The department also outlined in the Federal Register notice that upon completion of these public comments, this will lead to negotiated rulemaking, because these are all Title IV related issues, whether it be the loans or the institutional accountability or student access, and that the fact that they would be selecting negotiators through a process of another Federal Register notice outlining what the final topics for determination are, what committees will be put forward, and also the opportunity for various communities to put forth individual negotiators based on those topics and those issues to be discussed, and that you can continue to monitor that information on the department's rulemaking website that they've now established for the 2021 negotiated rulemaking. They also outlined that they would be having the negotiations begin no later than August 2021. I believe it'll probably be September, but it might be latter half of August where some of these begin, and that the committees will meet as they normally do, basically for 3 sessions for a week at a time, and a month in between for continuation of the dialogue and discussion offline. And offline is an important part right now, as the meetings were normally and always in the past have been handled and done in person. Well, you can see the next part of the highlighted information here, that in addition to the fact that we anticipate late August or September will be the start of 1 or more committee meetings, that the department intends to hold these meetings and these negotiations virtually as opposed to in person. There are a great deal of discussions around the fact that that doesn't seem to be well wedded to congressional intent in terms of having all of the parties involved basically sequestered and sitting together to try and negotiate these rules along with the department. Many of the presenters and commenters on all sides expressed concerns about the inability for these virtual negotiations to be consistent with a lot of the positive portions that they experienced either personally or part of groups in past negotiated rulemakings, whereby a lot of the true negotiating goes on in the hall or goes on at the breaks, where individuals will collectively or even one-on-one have a conversation or a dialogue that then leads to the potential bridge to get through a specific issue, or the ability to, while others are working and having the full negotiations, take a sidebar and go and work out on language and the like. Things that are not easily going to be accommodated in the notion of a virtual hearing. We will see how that continues to progress. I can tell you that I believe one of the reasons among many that the department is proposing it to be virtual is because we all have been in a virtual world because of the pandemic for the last 18 plus months. Another primary reason for the fact that they might be looking to do this virtually is a financial set of circumstances to determine whether or not they really didn't have and are scraping money together even as we speak for a number of other things. So the ability to hold these hearings in person might be cost ineffective for the department. You will see in the next line that they talk about they may take the length of time of the sessions and modify them, both in terms of the number of days of each sessions and the time in between each session. This could be based on not only, again, some of these determinations of which committees and what types of committees. I can see, and I'll share with you as we get through into the issues a little bit deeper, that I could see where some of these individuals could be smaller ad hoc subcommittees because the issue is so finite and it's only a smaller group of the broader higher ed community that would likely be interested in negotiating them. Things like ability to benefit or the student second chance Pell program for prisoners being two of those that come to mind that we'll talk about here in a little bit later. The dates and locations will once again be published on that new 2021 website. So I encourage you, excuse me, I encourage you to put this in one of your bookmarks and watch it on a pretty regular basis as we all watch this process and participate in this process as it unfolds. A couple of things with regard to the process and the like before I move along. CSPEN is definitely going to comment on the concerns with regard to a virtual meeting as well as the opportunity for it to be held in person. We will also comment in this area on issues of the number of participants and type of participation. After we go through all of the proposals, especially those most important on the institutional accountability side, I will talk to you a little bit more about a concept that I've been and others have been working on with me of how to recommend the breakdown of those committees with the effort to try and ensure that, especially on issues related to institutional accountability, that our community has more than one representative at the table, as well as potentially a student representative and other representatives at the table, as has happened in the past, whether that be veterans groups like the Veterans Education Project that were part of the last rounds of negotiation, a student or students from our community, not USSA or Student PERG entities that don't represent students from our community, as well as potentially different unique characteristics and individuals within our community. The beauty and wellness community certainly has unique characteristics that in the past have warranted and they've requested the opportunity to have their own seat at the table. The broader community of full proprietary institutions broken down versus degree versus non-degree have had separate seats in the past. And we also have, even as was presented yesterday, portions of our proprietary sector that focus predominantly on graduate programs. And they might like to have a separate seat at the table because of their unique differences. Just showing you that there is and are a broad number of constituencies even within our community. And the recognition is going to be, and the opportunity for positions at this negotiation table, as they always are going to be tight. So the ways in which we can once again work towards trying to gain more seats at the table, but do so in a respectable way to honor the negotiations and the focus on trying to come to a positive outcome, meaning consensus and a final regulatory package, might need those various different disaggregated groups within our own community as well as others. Now moving on to the actual summary of the major key issues and also what we learned and the takeaways from the virtual hearings. As you heard me say earlier, I basically deconstructed the group of 14 issues into 3 categories: the student loan program revisions, which include the discharge for total and permanent disability, the closed school discharges, the discharges for false certification of student eligibility, includes ATB, includes Social Security, and a number of other issues. The loan repayment plans, the big issue there being IDR, and then the public service loan forgiveness programs. Within the 14, those that I characterize and believe you would and hope you would agree with me are characterized as more institutional accountability or change of ownership and control, the certification procedures for Title IV participation, standards of administrative capability and below financial responsibility, the borrower defense to repayment plan process, and also mandatory pre-dispute arbitration agreements and class action lawsuits woven into parts of borrower defense and other issues, and then gainful employment. The 2 that I kind of characterize as student access are the ability to benefit proposals and the inclusion of those regulations, as well as the Pell Grant eligibility for the prison education programs. As I alluded to earlier, I believe that these 2 in particular could be grounds for subcommittees or smaller committees because, again, the number of institutions that are participants in ability to benefit and the number of institutions and programs that will be eligible for the new second chance Pell process, excluding our community, will be, again, a smaller number, and therefore the ability for those more individualized or more focused groups to have the opportunity to really hash out the regulations, the proposed regulations, and then bring them back to one of the full committees seems like a logical progression and might be, again, one of the reasons the Department of Education is leaving latitude in length of time and the construction of and timing for the committees and the like. What we will now do is spend a little bit of time having kind of deconstructed these and analyzing each of them and talking and sharing with you basically a 30,000 foot, but with a deeper dive in a number of key points, pro and con, on the issues of importance to us. With regard to the student loan programs and that whole cadre of issues that I just went through, the belief is, and CSPEN's analysis is, that a major focus of the department's desire to move forward on these are to clear up backlogs and to address issues and requests from the community to streamline and become more simplistic in the ways in which both income-driven and income-contingent repayment are focused, as well as the way professional student loan forgiveness is provided. There are key issues within each of those that I'll talk about here in a second that were omnipresent in the presentations. As I shared before with other individuals earlier this morning, it was interesting in the 3 days of the virtual hearings, as you broke it down statistically and just simply by sheer numbers of commenters, on day 1 and on day 2, there were roughly 52 and 60% of the comments that were on student loan related issues, and the institutional accountability making up the vast majority of the others, with ATB and student access and the Pell programs being somewhere in the vicinity of right around 5%, 3 to 5 to 10% at tops, at best, but still a considerable number. When you got deeper into the issues within public service loan forgiveness, IDR, and total and permanent disabilities, the breakdown of a number of the requests for revisions from the public comment, again, focused on the need to address the significant number of temporary and permanent disability claims that were denied or have yet to actually even be spoken upon. When you come to personal student public service loan forgiveness, many of the issues there are around not only the streamlining, but some complications that are making it so that a number of individuals who believed they were eligible for public service loan forgiveness because they were in the FELP program and not in the direct loan program were determined to be ineligible, that based on conversions from one program to the other and or from direct loans to consolidated direct loans, that their 10 years of on-time repayment that they made, that they thought would be the basis for them being granted public service loan forgiveness, were found to be ineligible because if you switched programs, the clock starts ticking back from zero. So you'd have to make 10 full years under the revised program. So a number of issues with regards to public service loan forgiveness that caused concerns. A number of other things that were interesting was in both the first, second, and then 40 or so percent in the third of individuals that were talking about these loan program issues focused very heavily on their belief that the Biden administration, now closer to 170 days into their new administration, have gone unfulfilled in a number of the commitments and promises that were made to the lending community, to the students on behalf of their loan debt and their loan-related issues. Those including the proposal that was included for debt cancellation at the $30,000 to $50,000 level, depending on who you talk to. And again, the progressives seeking it, Ms. Warren and Bernie Sanders seeking it at around $50,000. Mr. Biden talking about it on his plank at $30,000, but yet nothing has moved forward, even though during the first 100 days and subsequent to that, there have been major calls for him to either act through executive order or support and help push for congressional action to enact the changes to debt cancellation. Issues of interest rate reduction, loan capitalization, and as I said, a number of the public service loan forgiveness issues, and even more on very, very nuanced issues. The blowback and the level of frustration from a number of very, very strong, reputable entities on behalf of student borrowers, on behalf of institutions and the like, are all continuing to put pressure on the department to have these issues addressed. It'll be interesting as this continues to go forward to see how this happens. Another major issue that I didn't put here that was going to go under the more category is concerns from students, institutions, and the lending community about what the ultimate resolution is going to be to this September 31st deadline right now for the protections, student borrower protections under the pandemic. Everybody wants to know whether or not those relief from any loan payments, interest accrual, any corrective or punitive actions taking, such as wage garnishment and other things that are all on hold right now, are going to go back to the norm or reset to norm on October 1st or be extended further. The student loan providers, the administrators of the loan, need to know this information sooner rather than later, in their view, because they have to ramp up and be prepared to process and begin processing the loans and going back to servicing the loans, as well as private collection agencies on the far back end with default entities. The students want to know because they want to know whether or not their responsibilities to begin to repay are coming back sooner rather than later, or whether they will get a reprieve for another extended period of time, as yet undefined. And the institutions similarly just simply need to know what the expectations are, as well, as it does play a role in eligibility for institutions around issues such as loan repayment rates and cohort default rates and others that we'll talk about even more here in just a few minutes. Shifting now to the institutional accountability issues, we're going to take each one of these individually. I'm going to give you a little bit of the background of what I believe to be some of the major focus by the department in putting these on the list of 14 topics to begin with, and then focus on some of the key takeaways from the last 3 days, from the 3 of the last 4 days and the virtual hearings. With regard to change of ownership and change of control, You have to have lived under a rock not to have seen us reporting, the media reporting, Congress asking questions about, and others expressing grave concerns about, even through NASIKI, the process by which institutions that are for-profit attempt to change to and convert to a nonprofit status. We believe that these change of ownership and change in control, potential regulatory changes, will be in an effort to help address that. Congress has sent several letters, including those that we highlighted on our last webinar from Bobby Scott and the House Education and Labor Committee, focused on stopping until further review any more conversions from private for-profit to private nonprofit status, and also asking for a great deal of additional documentation around 90-10, with the assertion there being that one of the major reasons to convert from for-profit to nonprofit status is to get out from under some of the regulatory requirements, including 90-10 as a for-profit entity or institution. There are other portions of the subsections with regard to excluded transactions that we think will be part of that as well. These beliefs were affirmed by several presenters and commenters throughout the 156 to 58, including most notably the Century Foundation, who said that not only do they hope that the for-profit versus nonprofit conversions is brought up and brought together with additional regulatory oversight and modifications to limit and prohibit, but they also want a specific definition of control in order to try and further narrow and refine the opportunity for institutions to transition from one form to another. With regard to certification procedures, this is something that, again, we have heard from both the Biden administration during their campaign and subsequent to their election, that they are concerned about and want to make sure that there is greater oversight from the beginning all the way through the certification and continued participation of institutions. For many, we believe that that will include a focus on issues related to legal capabilities to seek personal financial liabilities in the event of school closures. Think about this in relation to the HERF 3 guidance and the new addition in the HERF 3 application process, where you had to sign personally as the individuals. If you're taking HERF 3 funds, you as the owner or director of the institution had to individually sign the application and also provide information on any individual with a 25% or more ownership interest in the institution or institutions. We see this as a continuation of efforts that have been done by not only the Century Foundation and TICAS and others, but recommendations coming from states attorneys general and elsewhere to try and push the department to utilize their enforcement capabilities under personal liability. They have that tool or that arrow already in their proverbial quiver, but have not used it. There are those that believe that they should have or should have gone further in attempts to use it around school closures such as Corinthian, ITT, Weldon, and Brooks Institute and others. So we perceive this being part of that. To further emphasize that, there were a number of commenters once again that brought back these planks from the Biden administration's campaign, most notably David Halpern, no friend to our community, a very harsh critic, in fact, of our community, specifically stated that he wanted Mr. Biden to fulfill his commitment to require for-profits to prove their value to students before being eligible to participate in the federal student financial aid programs. There are no areas where you can find what that proving or proof of value looks like. There are certainly a number of speculative or conjecture or rumors as to what that might look like. It includes the aforementioned discussion on personal financial liabilities. It could include things like the requirements for any of our institutions to be eligible to receive or to acquire a letter of credit prior to, or have individuals make specific financial guarantees on the front end. Also could include things like the potential for targeted, specified, bright line indicators of outcomes for just our community and our students and institutions. Another area that has cropped up multiple times recently in the hearings and is being promoted by Representative Takano from California and others from California is a more critical look at the amount of institutional instructional expenditures in relation to revenue. I believe that many of you, and certainly those of you who are on this webinar that are from California, are aware that there are specific prescribed requirements in statute around the amount, at least portions of funds that are revenue that must be used for instructional purposes. That process or that concept is moving as several things, including all the way back to 8515/9010. God, more years ago than I ever cared to count now, are originated out of California and moved their way across the country from state statute and state proposals to federal statute and federal proposals. These are all things around certification that we need to be aware of and be mindful of as this process unfolds, and certainly respond to in your various comments, and be prepared to respond to even more so in the deliberations, because I can assure you some variation of all of this will be forthcoming, and we're not going to be able to stop it from happening, but we need to be prepared to negotiate it as it comes forward. Similarly, with regard to administrative capability, given the scope of that portion of the regulations and all of the multitude of issues that are included, I highlighted here just some of the pieces that I believe are ripe for further discussion. Financial aid counseling, that was discussed by several commenters out of the group of 150 plus yet again on the fact that that was needed. Certainly cohort default rates, the withdrawal limitation for initial Title IV participation, as well as the principal and affiliate debarred or suspended requirements. All of these and more, including the first one, institutional administration and number of qualified to oversee the operations, are all things that I think are open for discussion. One that is not on this list but bears potential focus as well is as it relates to issues with regard to incentive compensation. We watched and have seen again time and time again, both in the Biden administration's proposals and in discussions recently in the House Education and Labor Committee, recommendations that under financial and administrative capability and the administrative capability side, that the incentive compensation rules should be extended beyond just the institution to the entities with which they seek to have support, meaning any of the groups or contracted entities that are involved in marketing, recruiting, and advertising, especially at our level, but potentially across all sectors, should be responsible and beholden to the same type of compensation requirements that institutions are held to under the financial and administrative capability requirements. As you would imagine, that would be a considerable step towards significant change within the marketing community. That is not necessarily, I don't know how all of them or candidly any of them do their compensation, but I would have to imagine it would cause at the very least, a complete and comprehensive review if that were to be extended. And again, onus placed on the institution, because you as the institution, anybody you contract with for marketing, recruiting, or advertising, financial aid support, or others, ultimately the liability still results back with you as an institution. So again, I think these are things that are going to be teased out later, but these are some of the ones that we are looking at right now under the administrative capabilities part, and others that are intertwined with some of the other issues that we'll talk about here in just a minute. In recognition of the pandemic, the other thing that I did want to highlight here, and as I alluded to earlier in the webinar, one of the things that the department is having a hard time grappling with, and candidly is something that's on some of our radar, but I think should be on more people's radar, is the fact that some of the traditional assessment tools, including cohort default rates, is kind of a void right now. Given the pandemic, given the aforementioned benefits to student borrowers, well-deserved and needed throughout the pandemic, to not have to have loan repayment unless they choose to, and no accrual of interest, and all of the other benefits for even individuals in default. That's going to lead to 1, 2, and possibly as many as 3 years of little to no cohort default rate data, or because the only people that will show up are students that are continuing based on their own decision and judgment to repay their loans, for institutions to basically have very, very low default rates or no default rates. And that takes away one of the administrative capability tools that we all know, unjustifiably I might add, but nevertheless we all know is used for the assessment of institutional quality and integrity. So in the void of that information, and also in the void of loan repayment information in many respects, because once again, that is being put on hold and may be put on hold for even longer. What's going to be are there going to be attempts by the department, and if so, what are they going to be to attempt to address these issues? I can tell you, and as you can see from the virtual takeaways, this is something the department is aware of. It's also something that Terry Hartle, who is the head of government relations for ACE, the American Council on Education, the umbrella group over all of higher education, shared with us at our policy meeting back in May, that they are focused on as a major concern and issue, because they know that the department is likely to fill it with something and they're not sure what it will be. There are those that believe it could be outcomes assessment and forms of review of completion, placement, retention, or licensure if it's applicable, or other issues. Again, you can see where that might work to our benefit, but the devil is in those details and what they will look like. And again, whether or not those type of issues being brought forward are exclusive of other sectors of the community or inclusive of them. The major issue that was a major theme throughout all of the 30 plus, 36, 35, 36 plus representatives from our community that talked over the last 3 virtual hearings, 3 days of virtual hearings, all resoundingly talked in terms of equity, as you would expect us to, and the fact that any and all of these institutional accountability requirements should be subject to the full review and full opportunity for application to all sectors of the higher education community and not singled out. We'll see how that all plays out, especially when you think of things like, what does this do for HBCUs, HSIs, and other institutions who are seeing their default rates go up? We could now find a set of circumstances where, keep in mind, 3 years of eligibility based on 3-year cohorts, right? This could mess up 1, 2, or 3 of those cohorts and basically dial everybody back to eligible for at least another 3 years after that. And with that being a 3-year trailing indicator, that's a 6-year window. You can imagine there's a lot of individuals, particularly critical of our community, that don't like the notion that that might be the case. Big issue, one that received probably within institutional accountability the most discussion, even more so than gainful employment, that we'll talk about in a moment, but they ran a close 1-2, is a return to the old Obama administration's borrower defense to repayment rules. That would include class action opportunities, which were removed from the process by the Trump administration. Separate slide on that we'll talk about next. The potential defenses for the institution, i.e. think back, the original borrower defense to repayment rules, institutions had very limited, if any, capability to discuss or provide information, data, response, or rebuttal to the claims brought forward to the institution, either in a class or by individuals. It was the department who would be basically investigator, judge, and jury, but without any discussion or dialogue, or very, very limited with the institution. With the Trump administration's revisions to borrower defense, the opportunity for both sides to have a full and equal sharing and vetting of their view of the circumstances was provided and is provided in current regulation. The question is the degree to which we will be able to keep that, or whether it will be severely restrained or removed going forward. Also, while the triggers remain, even under the Trump administration's borrower defense to repayment regime and the process that they put forward, we believe that there will be significant efforts to enhance and further both the mandatory and the discretionary triggers that are there, learning from and also hopefully learning from the pitfalls of some of those now that we've had them in effect for years, as well as potentially some of the benefits to keeping some or modifying them. Again, the primary takeaways were that this was one of the major issues. A number of students brought forward their own views and opinions of hardship and negative circumstances with multiple different institutions within our community, both those that are still open as well as some of those that are closed. The one that was most notable was Miss Sweet, who is the lead plaintiff in Sweet versus DeVos, now Sweet versus Cardona, which is litigation that is being brought forward on behalf of Brooks Institute, former Brooks Institute's students, asserting and alleging fraud and misrepresentation with regard to the Brooks Institute, and the inability to get any or even partial restoration or restitution under the borrower defense claims, and the fact that many of the students believe that there was insignificant level of review of their individual complaints. Keeping in mind, under Trump administration, there weren't class actions anymore. It was individual by individual, but that the vast majority of those and the vast majority of all borrower defense repayment claims have either been opposed or only given partial relief as opposed to full relief. There are those that again emphasize that they believe that under the new administration, and the hope would be under new revised proposals and procedures, that individuals that have only received in the past partial relief would be eligible for another review and potentially more relief, and that many individuals would just be given blanket coverage and relief, not only from their past borrowing, but also resetting their ability for eligibility for both grants and loans to go into higher education or further their education from a different institution. So there are a number of nuanced issues here, along with the things that we've already talked about and already know about. Entailed with that, on the regulations that came forward both times, were discussions around pre-dispute arbitration, binding arbitration agreements, included and embedded in most institutions across all of higher education's enrollment agreements, and in other contracts that even student athletes sign as part of their scholarships, and the list goes on and on and on. The desire is, once again, by this administration and student advocates and others, to have that repealed and removed. Everything old is new again. You'll recall that you had pre-dispute arbitration agreements in many of your enrollment agreements. You had to take them out, you had to modify things, and then you put them back in with the new regulations from the Trump administration. You may go through that same exact process with changes yet again. And the other major portion is, as I alluded to earlier, the notion of class action lawsuits. The process for borrower defense to repayment was taken away from being one where states attorneys general or the department or others could establish a class of like individuals, to where there would no longer be an assessment based on the individual circumstances, but everybody in a cohort or everybody as made a part of the class would get the same benefits of the outcome of complaints or efforts brought forward, again, with limited to no opportunity for the institution to defend their actions, defend their decisions, or defend the fact that some may be eligible for and others not necessarily eligible for partial or full relief. Think about this in the context that has been brought forward. Granted, this is the most liberal version of this, but what if you're in the class and you've got your, and the class is for loan relief, but you completed your program and you got a job? Does that individual, or should that individual, simply because they were part of the cohort in time at that institution where the institution fulfilled its mission, and obviously the individual benefited, but as part of the class could still get the benefit of having all of their loan responsibilities removed, and also new eligibility for continuing in their education? Nothing against individuals, but the question becomes, is that a reasonable expectation or a reasonable way to go through the process? That and many other things will be part of the discussions yet again. Financial responsibility, what was intriguing to me here is we know that the department for quite some time, and the Trump administration even made public the fact that they were hoping to do a negotiated rulemaking in their second term around a comprehensive review of financial responsibility. We don't believe that that comprehensive review is what the department intends by their inclusion of this bullet or this proposal in the list of 14 topics. It would certainly be one that would be necessary to do all on its own, given the complexities and just the sheer size of all of what is included in CFR subpart L, Part L, and the appendices. We do think that it'll be more narrowly focused, could continue to build on questions around potentially what waivers or what relief is or isn't established for institutions looking at composite scores going forward for the next couple of years, in recognition of the pandemic and in recognition that all sectors of higher education have had expressed and voiced concerns about their composite scores. While not all institutions are suffering, many are, and their rates are going to reflect that at all levels, whether it be private, nonprofit, private for-profit, not the state institutions because they have the backing of the state. But this is a significant issue, and to date, even with multiple requests, the department underneath either the Trump administration or the Biden administration has failed to give any indication of whether or not there will be any relaxing of the enforcement, maybe not the review, but the enforcement and the potential actions taken based on financial responsibility. I am very much surprised that nobody brought that up. It certainly will be one of the things that CSPEN brings up in our comments, and we would encourage others to do so as well, if for no other reason than to continue to apply the steady pressure that many within our community and other communities have applied for literally 6 months now, and even longer going back into 2020. The other issues that will be part of this we'll have to pay specific attention to. Again, these are areas where small changes can have a big difference, especially when you think of this in the context of heightened cash management 1 and 2 and some of those criterion. So we're watching to see whether or not that's part of where they go with these negotiations, and we'll certainly be looking to be responsive depending on what we learn going forward. What was, again, very interesting is very few commenters brought this issue up, meaning financial responsibility in its entirety, much less any of the nuances, pro or con, that I was just speaking of. Gainful employment, the other one that goes hand in glove with BDR as areas and issues where the vast majority of the institutional accountability discussion was focused upon. You can rest assured that the goal here is to return to some form of a gainful employment rule. Think back to not only all of the reporting requirements that necessitated, both on your website, in all of your student information, whether that be not only on your website, but in your enrollment agreement and elsewhere. But there are also a lot of discussions around the particulars. There were across the board, whether it be our community, the community colleges, or others, significant discussions about the over-complex nature, and I'll show you that on the next slide. But some of the things that we think the department is looking at here is whether or not they will use both of the rates, the annual earnings and the discretionary income rate. In the past, there have been recommendations to do away with one or the other of these rates. I will go all the way back to the days of David Bergeron and Dan Madzellen with gainful employment first-time discussion. Keeping in mind we're now headed into our fourth, that they said that the one thing that they would do over again above all else is eliminate the annual earnings rate and just go with the discretionary income rate. For those of you who will recall back to your rates in the two computations, that was the more conservative and the more harmful of the two earnings rates that are two eligibility rates that were put out there. There will be questions once again of whether or not there needs to be the pass, fail, and zone, and whether or not it should just go back to as GE1 had, just pass or fail. What are the appropriate eligibility thresholds for that pass-fail rating or any of the zone ratings? Many individuals gave testimony and data showing that 8% doesn't seem to be the right metric, regardless of sector of education, for the programs and institutions that are subject to the rule. And therefore, we're requesting that a reconsideration of what that threshold will be. There are a number of institutions, predominantly community colleges, HBCUs, and others, that requested exemption and expressed the fact that this was not really based on their data, something that should be applicable to them and should only be applied to those institutions with a history of any type of issue or concern. Didn't come right out and name the proprietary sector, but on several occasions went right up to the line. And there was kind of an overarching statement that was, again, as I said, supported from all sides, that these are overly complex and burdensome, administratively burdensome, and need to have work done to modify them. Takeaways, as you can see, as I just alluded to, the fact that there is a great deal of belief that these need to be better, more informed, and better constructed. AACS, among others, talked about litigation in the past that has shown some of the arbitrary and capricious nature of these regulations in the past. Also notices of, again, unique characteristics from between different sectors within our community and within the broader community of eligible programs. Their major focus, as it should be, and as is others that have service-related industry programs, is a concern of the underreporting of tip income and the implications that that has from a workforce perspective on the overall GE rates. There are a number of other issues that also are being discussed, and what types of accommodations, again, could be provided for different groups. Again, even within our own community, this extended from one end with a group of institutions that are predominantly graduate and professional degrees, even within the proprietary sector, saying this is not the intent of these regulations that are more geared toward workforce-driven related programs. You had the beauty and wellness community that once again said, we have unique characteristics, not asking to be exempted from the regulations, but truly, and I believe justifiably, asking for some opportunities for recognition that a one-size-fits-all assessment doesn't work when there are known by all entities, the IRS, the Department of Education, the institutions themselves, that underreporting happens, and that therefore the information being provided and assessed is inaccurate. How you address that and what you do about that is a hard discussion, because again, you're basically in some respects asking all parties concerned, while acknowledging that the individuals are breaking the law, that based on a known recognition of them breaking the law, you're going to provide some potential latitude or some flexibility for those institutions. They can't control it. Those are individuals that have long since successfully gotten their licensure and are in the workforce, which is what the institutions were committed and succeeded in doing. But now under gainful employment, that can have a backlash. And there are many other stories of many other types of institutions where we could have similar discussions as well, all of which is part of where we need to go. As you can see, as a result of that, there were many different groups that provided really, really solid commentary and data to support their positions on these issues. Several of the past negotiators yet again reminded individuals that as you look at this, simply earnings may not be the best or only part of the equation. Mark Jerome actually went so far as to suggest that the department, if it was going to address and have a gainful employment negotiation, also should have a separate negotiation solely focused on completion rates, and provide all institutions with the responsibility to develop established standards and guidelines for defining completion rates, and providing all institutions to put forth publicly available information on what completion rates look like, whether that be in the context of gainful employment or separately. He and others alluded to the fact that we can have these type of crude metrics that don't really show the whole story. Again, the stories you'll recall from the past of inconsistency and incongruency of two institutions with same ownership, same identical program, one in an urban, one in a rural setting, one passes, one fails. Nothing different other than population served and location. So is that an effective utilization of how to determine eligibility and the like? All of which, again, will be part of comments that I know others and we will be putting forward. So where does that all leave us? Well, it leaves us with the fact that by next Thursday, anybody who chooses to still has the opportunity to comment. What CSPEN is committing to do is we will be providing both our comprehensive list of all of the recommendations that we have heard. Again, that's a cross-section of the virtual hearing comments, discussions CSPEN is having with our CPA roundtable, our attorney roundtable, our state association roundtable, our legal roundtable, and our lobbyist roundtables, so that we can give you the bullets from and the wealth of information from all of those different representative groups and all of their frame of references in small bulleted fashion for you to consider. We will be putting together our final list of draft of that and circulating it on our website and calling attention to that on Monday. We will request that if you have any comments or areas that we either aren't as fully versed as we should be, or areas where you think that there's something that on behalf of our students and our community is missing, please share it with us. We'll try and see whether we can put it in. The deadline for those comments will be by no later than midday on Wednesday, giving us time on Wednesday afternoon and Thursday to make any additional additions or modifications before submitting our comments on Thursday, July 1st, the submission deadline. We will be sharing with you that information once again as the process moves forward, and when we have our final, we will be posting that on the CSPEN website as well. All of that leading to, given all of what I've just gone through in the last hour and 10 minutes, are there any scotomas? Are there any things that you didn't hear in particular that are of major relevance and importance? Keeping in mind that both the commenters as well as I can't hit every single issue, and that's why we want to put the written information in front of you by Monday, along with our consolidated notion of we're not going to be able to cover everything because we don't want to respond a comment that's like this big, but to make sure that we hit on at least all of the major issues, some of the nuanced issues, and continue to open the door for our community's participation, our community's complete participation on the committee or committees, and the ability to work towards regulations that, dare I say it, we can try and live with. With that, I will open it up for additional questions or commentary. I do see two right now. The 14 topics that the department has raised with respect to the most of the sections and topics, does CSPEN have any specific points it feels should be raised as we craft our comments? Again, that's what we're hoping to do and share with you all on Monday. We do realize that it's cutting it close, but candidly, we and the board talked about this. We were going to put these out Friday a week ago, but we wanted to be better informed by seeing what was discussed, both pro and con, so that we can attempt to at least tacitly, if not more aggressively, address some of the counter comments that were put forward as well. Tom, what is your take on the video of Secretary Cardona states his support for equity across higher education sectors? Well, the good news is that yes, in fact, Secretary Cardona did make comments in response to questions from Representative Keller from Pennsylvania, who asked him twice about his views on the proprietary community and proprietary sector, of the fact that he did believe that all sectors of higher education needed to be treated equally. But you have to juxtapose that with comments he made later this week at NASFA, at their virtual conference, where he said that there is distinction and differences between for-profits and nonprofits and other types of institutions, and that there have been problems in the for-profit community that warrant different treatment of them. And he went so far to say the line that was similar to, if not identical to what I alluded to earlier from David Halperin, that it probably means that proprietary institutions are going to have to prove their eligibility to participate. So you can see where probably from where he was on the early part of the week to where he got by the end of the week was with some discussions from the White House, probably with discussions from individuals internally and also external groups that didn't like the statement that the secretary made earlier in the week. Don't shoot the messenger. Tom, we really think that there is a need to have more representation by the community. I listened to all of the hearings, or most of them, and agree with you that there needs to be a push to have multiple seats at the table. Agreed. Again, I will bring this up and we'll see where it goes in CSPEN's comments. I am actually envisioning proposing that the institutional accountability be one separate negotiations and the student loan issues be another. And as I said, the ATB and Pell Grants be subcommittees. On the institutional side, and keep in mind, for those of you who participate in ATB, with full and complete participation by our community as one of the entities in that subcommittee. What I also want to focus on is, under institutional accountability, is making the case that to the degree possible, there needs to be multiple representatives from especially those communities that they believe are the most problematic. Call them out on, if we're supposedly the problem, then put more of us around the table so that we can help you come up with an effective solution. And in doing so, do so politely, but also remind them that, as I said and alluded to earlier, that student groups and individuals from student groups and individual students all demand more and more seats at both tables, more so at the loan table, because of their belief that they have earned and they were committed to many things under public service loan forgiveness and under the Biden administration's campaign that have yet to come through, and they want to force some of those things through. In deference and appreciation to their concerns, but in reality, negotiated rulemaking is not the place where some of that is going to or can happen. Some of the things, as is always the case, from all portions of the interested parties, were a number of very impassioned pleas and proposals that simply the department is going to be unable to do because they require statutory revisions in order to do so, and therefore statutory authority or intent are limiting the ability for what some people think should be done to even be part of the negotiations. But again, as we move forward, we're going to support and mirror what all of our community has talked about, which is there at least needs to be equitable representation as well as equitable treatment within all of these negotiations, but then also maybe see if there are ways to at least request, maybe not achieve, but request greater representation on the areas that it is very apparent are going to have a significant effect on our students and on our schools. Don't see any other questions or comments at this point, but if anybody else has any, we still have a few minutes, and if not, then I will wish you a good Friday, but let me give another minute or two to see if anybody else has anything else to add. Seeing none other than some recognition and appreciation for the webinar, which thank you. We will close with a reminder that we will be continuing the summer webinar series. We won't do one next Thursday because it's July 1st, and we will be making sure that we finish up this submission and leading into the July 4th weekend. But we will be doing one the following week on July 8th. We hope that all of you will participate on that, but moreover, we hope that all of you will go to the CSPEN website on Monday. We will be sending out the Tom Bombs, the email blast that sends you there so that you can see all of our compressed bullets and then our draft response and give feedback. And we also encourage you to please don't forget that we want as many of you that can make it to join us on August 16th through the 19th in Chicago for our 7th annual conference. We have got a stellar group of participants. We're focusing on the humanities. And what I mean by that is, you know, the current day is a great deal of focus on equity in terms of racial and gender equity. And we have a number of focused presentations on those broad overarching issues, as well as you would imagine, concise multiple presentations on the regulatory and statutory issues, as well as marketing and other key aspects of your institution. For those of you who are unaware, Monday on the 16th will be a phenomenal day where we will be out at the AIM campus, the Aviation Institute of Maintenance's campus, for what I'm calling a career education expose. What I mean by that is we will be having the employers of our graduates and school representatives from multiple sectors and disciplines all together to share and provide detailed summaries and demonstrations of their work in those areas and discussions within those areas. We are inviting major both state level and federal level Chicago and Illinois representatives, as well as all of the individual guidance counselors from in and around the Chicago area to come and be part of this, to learn and experience what it is that we do in providing the quality education leading to immediate jobs in the workforce that are needed now, whether it be for the infrastructure and the return to the new normal post-COVID, or just simply the further advancement of all individuals in higher education based on their choice of the institution that best meets their needs, that leads to their success. With that, I want to conclude and wish you all a happy weekend. Mine will be obviously a little busy, as you might assume, making sure that all of this is buttoned down by Monday. But we look forward to your support, your engagement, and your recommendations as we work on your behalf to submit recommendations on behalf of our collective community to the department by next Thursday. Have a great weekend. Thank you for all that you do. We hope that you appreciate what we're doing, and we want to be able to make sure that we continue the dialogue so that we provide representation for you in the most appropriate fashion. Have a great weekend, everybody.